right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on Overflow. It is good to be back. We took a couple weeks off, and we are back in action. And so, as always, we like to get together every Monday at noon to reflect on the sermon from the day before and to talk about what we took from it, what we learned, but really how to practically integrate these ideas and concepts into our daily life. We don't just want to be a church that is learning about scripture or about spiritual concepts, but is not only learning, but intentionally implementing these things into our daily lives to model Christ and to be like Christ. And so we are almost finished with our perspective series, Seeing God's Self in Others, where we've been looking at the Enneagram tool in order to become more self-aware of how God has uniquely wired us and made us, and to better be able to love and work with others as we understand our different personality types. And so today we're going to be recapping the sermon from yesterday, which is Enneagram Type 7, which I did, so I'll give the recap. And then we're going to talk about kind of our final discussion week 9, which is really what have we gotten out of this series. And so it's taking a look back at what we've learned, what we've experienced, and what we've applied, and how we've grown through this. And so hopefully you've got some good things that you're thinking through, have been very helpful, and that you've been able to practically implement in your life. So today joining us, we have Aaron and myself. So Ryan, and I think you can see our names like on the little bottom there. So it's pretty basic. But a simple recap. I feel like I gave like my life story in the sermon yesterday, and I tried to stuff it full, like with as much stuff as possible. And so it's 46 minutes of like constant engagement. And so it's definitely a marathon if you can get all the way through it. But basically, I walked through and broke down Enneagram Type 7, strengths, weaknesses, core sins and desires. I talked about what health and unhealth, stress and growth look like. We talked through the story of King David and all these different pieces of his journey, and how looking at his journey through the lens of the Enneagram Type 7 brings a lot of clarity into why he was the way he was and things he did and said and those sorts of things. We looked at how to love Type 7s, how to work with 7s, healthy spiritual practices, and just some key significant verses that are good for Type 7. And so if you're a 7, if you have a wing of a 7, if you go to 7 in stress or growth, or even if you just know a 7 in your life, these are just all really, really helpful things. And so, yeah, we're going to get started with just what are some things that maybe kind of stood out to us that are important or helpful. And if you are joining us live, feel free to say hi in the chat or to ask us a question, and we'd be happy to engage with you. So, Aaron, I'm going to put the pressure on you first, but is there anything from the message that kind of stood out to you as interesting or helpful, or even just something to chat more about?
So one of the things I love that you talked about was that, and I think we may have talked about this on Overflow before, but you talked about like being Ryan 2.0, and like how you've grown in like, I think we talked about maybe a little bit in emotionally healthy relationships too. But just, I love that concept of how you talked about how, naturally you would avoid a negative emotion. And so it's been a spiritual practice for you to kind of sit in grief or things like that. Like, and so what I love about what that says about Enneagram as a whole, because the Enneagram kind of describes like our core, right? Like at our most natural state, or like our core desire, our core fear. And so like, it can be easy to, sorry, just a second. My kid's office just called me. So it can be easy to like stereotype in some ways, right? Because it's like, it can be easy to say, oh, you're 7, so you feel this way. But in fact, what I love for us as Christians with this tool is that we know that the Holy Spirit grows us, right? And that we know that we are growing, and that, God is calling us to growth and does that work in us. And so I was really struck by not just describing what a 7's like core fear motivation would be, but also just that growth, right? It's not a stereotype, but it's us understanding our perspective of the world so we can grow to be more like Christ. And I really loved how you talked about that so much in your sermon, because I just thought that was just good for all of us to see, like, we can identify these things in ourselves, but then also like a very practical, like, here's how we can also use this to grow and to be intentional in our walk. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I think you're totally right on that. A lot of the Enneagram sort of gives like our base, our starting point, or our foundation. But there is a lot in there about growth and about development. And but that's really, really important. And, I've talked with a lot of people through the series, and I think some people have expressed that they feel sort of stuck in this. Okay, I've accepted this is my type. I've kind of unpacked it and I see how I relate and I understand myself much more clearly. But where do I go from there? What do I do? Some of these things I feel stuck in. Is this a box that I'm in forever? Am I kind of pinned down? And I think looking at this series and this tool and the word of the Lord for how we can be intentional to grow, to be more like Christ, is incredibly important and is a big portion of this. And what's interesting is, from person to person, Aaron, in your personality, you might not need the discipline of sitting in the struggle or the pain, like that might not be a very helpful practice for you. And for you, it might be something totally different that you need in order to become more like Christ, And so part of what I love about this experience is it's almost a little bit more custom and tailored discipleship for us. I know that I talked to a few Enneagram 7s after the service, and they said, yes, exactly. Like, this is me, like I don't want to deal with the negative stuff. I just want to move on quickly, and I distract myself with all sorts of things. And so I think there were a lot of 7s realizing that they have these tendencies to just move on. And one of the things I love about the series is we're putting language to common experiences that we didn't realize were so common or identifiable. And it's all of a sudden like, oh, that's a thing that I do. Oh, that's a thing that other people do that have similar personality types. Oh, and it's a thing I actually need to address and give it to the Lord and ask him to do a redemptive work in. And so for me, I always saw it as a strength of like, everyone gets so bogged down by all this like sad stuff all the time. I'm just so strong. I just move forward, And I saw that as a strength for a long time. But as I've grown in health and maturity and Ryan 2.0, yeah, I've definitely seen the importance of embracing my emotions and bringing them to the Lord and processing them there. So, yeah, thanks for sharing that and for bringing that up for sure. One of the things I enjoyed too was talking with a few people who were just really processing what they learned yesterday for how to treat people in their lives. And so there's some that said, hey, I have a significant other. That's totally a 7. Or I've got a boss at work or a coworker. That's totally a 7. Or I've got some friends. And one of the things I appreciate is they said, they just make a lot more sense to me now. And I think that's just really, really helpful. In order to love people well, we need to know them well in order to know how to love them well. And if God calls us to love others as he loves us, knowing that God fully knows us, the depths of our being, then we need to know and understand other people in order to love them well. And that's so much of this series. And so I really appreciated how there was a lot of clarity for people with their significant others and coworkers and friends, and to just understand, the motivation of a 7 to avoid pain, to experience joy. That's what they're trying to do. They're not trying to bail on me. They're not trying to like go off without me. They're not trying to just push me past my struggles or not empathize. They just have a different value set and a different value system than I do. And so I think there was just I got the sense that there was just a lot of understanding yesterday, how 7s work and how to work with 7s and how to value and appreciate them, but also like understand where they're lacking and struggling or behind.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that. Do you feel like as a 7, do you feel like you're often misunderstood in that way?
It's really funny. There are some people that totally get me and some people that are so off base. And it cracks me up because for example, growing up, I had teachers that I felt like they either loved me or they hated me. Like that was like what my experience was. The teachers who were very like rule focused, organization, follow directions, they didn't like me. Like I was always coloring outside of the lines, literally, and like I was always challenged because I've got a wing of an A. I was always challenging, like, well, is that the only way to do it, or should we do it that way, or can I do the assignment this way? Like I was the student, like a lot of teachers were very frustrated by. But then I had teachers who I felt like really understood me, and they saw that I was trying to be creative, out of the box thinking, be innovative, be excited about what I was doing, and I would have them just like support that or give into that and be like, why don't you go? Yeah, let's see what you can do. Let's see, and I remember I have so many stories, but my geometry teacher in high school, there was like a project, and it was a simple little project you were supposed to do, but I just came up with some grand plan, like what if I did this, or what if I did that, and can I do this? And it was kind of the assignment, but not quite the assignment. And I love that she was just like, go for it. Like, I want to see what you can do, And those teachers just really unleashed me to jump into kind of how I was made. And so it's interesting because I've had people all throughout my life who've just felt like you are just always trying to like get under people's skin and just like avoid what's going on, and just like you don't do what you're supposed to, and like so it's just different. Different personality types work well together and just super clash. And um I think the other part too is like me even understanding like why I am the way I am, or how I am. It's like put language for me to think through, hey, okay, like I have kind of always done this in my life. This is probably why, and this is what I'm trying to do. So that's been really helpful.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear you say that, because for me as a one, right, like not to take over your answer, but like to hear you say that like the classes you really thrived in were the classes where you were allowed to push the boundaries, right, and like to be creative and like to do, that's my nightmare, right? Like I'm in a class right now, I'm trying to write a final paper and the parameters are very vague, and it's just, I'm struggling because I'm just like, I just want to know, for me as a one, like I just want to know the exact expectations so I can meet it. I always like to color perfectly in the lines. You just want to color outside of the lines. And so I just love how the Enneagram like helps us identify, like there's a place in the world for both and all, right? There's a place, there's goodness in all of it. And I just love how we can better identify that, like in other people and in ourselves, so that we can like really enable ourselves and one another to thrive and grow in community and in our relationship with God. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it kind of throws me into just what does it look like for us to lead a church full of such diverse people, and diverse on the Enneagram personality types, diverse politically, socially, ethnically, cultures, language, backgrounds, experience, economic status. Like you've got this whole group of people who would not normally be in the same neighborhood or the same workplace or the same school or the same social club. We've all come together for and in the name of Jesus, and God calls us to unity. But it's such a stretch because we're with people that we might not normally be hanging out with, that we might not normally have, or that we don't have as much in common other than Christ in our lives. And so the church is almost like an amazing social experiment of getting all these different kinds of people together, but with the mindset of we're all made in God's image, and God has made us uniquely different. He's designed us to need and depend on one another, even if we're different. I think is just a beautiful proclamation to the world, especially where social media and posts are just creating, and all sorts of media, even more of a widespread of an us versus them, the other side. There's just, I feel like even more conflict, and more extremes of opinions and beliefs and things like that about what's going on in the world. And yet here we are trying to be a voice to the world, to say like we can be united by the power of the Lord, even amongst such incredible diversity.
Yeah, I love that.
So yeah, so type 7, I hope it was helpful and fun. and fun is very important. So
So please let it have been fun.
yeah, somebody joked, they laughed, they said they laughed so much when I said, like, we're not going to talk much about the negative stuff because it's a 7. So
Right. So we're just not touching that.
yeah.
I actually expected more dancing in your sermon. Actually, I expected a little more, but
Yeah, in my rehearsal I did some break dancing, but I just felt like I had the mic in my hand, and like it was, I could just hear people saying, like, what's he doing? Like, this is crazy.
yeah, a broken mic would have been a bummer too.
Yeah, for sure. In my original plan, I was going to come out with like a tambourine hat and a bass drum and then a snare drum and then like the ankle like bells and like do the little like kazoo thing, cymbals on my elbows, and that was going to be my thing, but I ran out of time preparing that. So
Bummer. I would have loved to see that, Brian.
okay, let's switch into our kind of reflection. And so, kind of what we're asking people to do this week is to really reflect on this series. And I've enjoyed having conversations with people. One of the most consistent comments is, when we started this series, I was a little skeptical. I was unsure of how this would work and if this was a good idea and if I would really buy into this. But by now, I've really loved seeing how people are made and understanding people, and it has been really, really helpful. And so I think a lot of people kind of halfway through the series started taking the assessment and started reading up on their type as they felt more trust and confident in the series and in this tool, and have really seen it be helpful. And I think that's been really, really cool. And most people I've talked to have said, I'm sharing it with my brother, my sister, my parents, my cousins, my neighbors, my coworkers. I'm having them take the assessment. I'm pointing them to the stuff. And then we're having conversations. And I've just loved, it's probably been one of the series, along with Emotionally Healthy Relationships, our last series, that I've heard the most people talk about sharing with others. Mm-hmm. And I really love that. And I think that just awakened a reminder in me that that's how the gospel needs to be. Is we've got to be experiencing transformation, experiencing God in such a powerful way that, like the woman at the well in John 4, we can't help but want to tell people about what's going on. And so I think that's been really exciting. And so our final week here on Overflow for this series, and we'll probably touch a little bit on this next week too, but is really, what have we taken away? So some of the questions we have are, how have you become more self-aware or even become more aware of others? And so let's start there. Aaron, what would you say for you? How has this series and this tool helped you to become more self-aware and aware of others and how they function?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a 1, so ours was a long, long time ago. It feels like a few months ago. But one of the things, aside from the general of just like, when I react to something, why do I react this way? Why do certain things make me upset? Or, things like that. Like on a personal level, as a 1, going through this series has made me realize that my natural disposition is often to be very critical of myself. And like, I didn't realize how much like that has affected my life or my work, my family. And so I've been able to identify that and then kind of bring that into my prayer life a little more and work through like, it's one of those things. It's like, I just didn't realize that not everyone sees the world that way. Or like if I watch a sermon back that I did or something like that, and I'm just like so critical of all these things, my husband's like, nobody even noticed that, but for me, it's like, I can very naturally, I think because I have a good awareness of how things should be or how things can look when they're the best. I tend to be, a little more like able to notice pitfalls or where things can be improved, which can be a gift and a skill that is needed. And I want to affirm that in ones that like we bring so much to the table, but also in my own life that was something that was hindering my walk or hindering my effectiveness at work or at home. And so for me, and just remembering God's promises, like remembering what God says about who I am. Like for me, I've started keeping an encouragement file. So when things, when I hear good things or when things go well, or I just get good feedback, like I keep that. And like, so that I can counterbalance kind of where I might be off center sometimes in my own view of things. And that's been really helpful. And then just awareness of others, like just for me, learning so much more about what everyone brings to the table and how the people I work with, people in staff meetings, the people in my home, my friends, my life group, like how they come and see the world, really helps me understand how I can better communicate that with them, like what really matters to them and how I can meet them in that, and why they might respond the way they do to something. If I don't understand someone's reaction to something, the Enneagram gives me a little more skills, a little more tools in my toolbox to say, oh, well, I know that this person, kind of sees things this way, or it has a general, general disposition. Of course, everyone's different, but just to have those skills and the awareness of just how we've all been made so differently. Like you were saying, like all of our diversity, and just being able to improve my relationships because I have better understanding of how other people see the world. And I think that's just so valuable, especially right now in a time that can be isolating from COVID, in a time where things can be polarizing. There's, all kinds of things. Like this is the time for us as the church, to be countercultural and to be unified and to love one another and to understand one another and to meet each other where we're at. And I love the kind of skills that the Enneagram gives for that, and that this series has really just helped me a lot in so many of those relationships.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing. That's really, really great. It kind of sounds like Ryan 2.0 has learned to dwell in his pain, and Aaron 2.0 has learned to dwell in her like accomplishments and celebrations and wins, things that you've done well.
And understanding that other people might not see it the same way as me, and there's beauty in that, and how can we utilize that?
Yeah, for sure. I love that journal too. I think it's so easy to forget, what God has done and what's gone well and our accomplishments and successes. I think that's super cool. I have a habit of taking a screenshot anytime somebody sends me like a text of, hey, this sermon was really helpful, or hey, I really appreciate your ministry in this area. I just always screenshot it and I just save it on my phone. So that way, if I'm ever just kind of looking through my old photos, it'll just kind of like pop up in there and I'll just, oh, I remember this. That's so cool. So that's fun for me. For me, becoming more self-aware. Yes, I think I've just become much more self-aware. And part of that too is just seeing how everyone else views me a little bit more clearly. And that kind of has just given me some different dimensions of kind of how I function, embracing negative emotions, and also that my engagement in most every situation is how to have a good time. And so if I'm with family or friends or by myself or whatever location I am, if I'm traveling, if I'm playing a sport or riding a bike or whatever I'm doing, that the underlying value for me is how do I make this an even better time? And so it helps me to understand that my contribution, let's say I'm, camping with friends or I'm doing stuff, the things I'm saying, hey, why don't we do this? It's not based on what I think other people need or want, or what I think would be like a good idea. It's more like, how could we make what we're doing like even more epic? Like that's really what I'm trying to contribute all the time. And so in some situations that can be helpful, and in some situations that's stressful, and in other situations it can be offensive. And just trying to understand those dynamics, I think, has been really, really big. And understanding my need for alone time and contentment with the Lord and in his presence, and why that's like extra important for me. Not just, hey, we're Christians, we're supposed to do that, Jesus got away to be with the Father, but really even more so, I need that time. And so, yeah, I just feel like, something for me, I got sick a few years ago, And it kind of set me on this journey of like, hey, why is my body doing this? What is it reacting to? What's working? And I learned a ton about the digestive system and about, what we put in our bodies. And I did a bunch of research. And now I'm at this point where it's like, I understand based on what I eat or what I've done or what I haven't done, why my body might react to a certain way. And it's taken the anxiety out of it. And I really am very aware of I'm exactly why I'm getting the results I'm getting. And I think this has really helped me with that in my personality of I understand so much more why I'm getting the results I'm getting, why I want to do certain things or don't want to do certain things, and what I really need in my life. As far as being aware of others, I think that I used to really look at everyone else in a two-dimensional way. I would pretty much line everybody up with what a 7 is, and how good you were at being a 7 determined if I liked what you were doing or not, or if I connected with you. And so, and I wouldn't have the language for this in the past, but I think just in what I'm seeing, as we talk about the coloring inside the lines or outside of the lines, Ryan 1.0, might meet a 1 who really values coloring inside the lines. And for me, I would go, that is like totally missing the point, that's just so far off base. How do we rescue this poor line in colorer, and help them to like finally be free? Because what I was really looking at is how do I help everybody be a 7, because that's the way. And I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but that's totally what I was doing. And so and then other people who relate with 7 type tendencies would be like, oh, they totally get it. Like this is great, And so I think one of the biggest things for me is I've been freed from seeing the world through the lens of everyone needs to be a 7, and you're valued based upon how 7 you function. And I've really learned to value and appreciate all the different types in the Enneagram and all the different ways that people can be Christ-like in unique ways from each other. And not only to see those and recognize them, but to value them, to appreciate them, to need them, and to delight in how collectively we can model the image of Christ. And I think it has helped me to articulate appreciation and gratitude for people being strong in their own uniqueness and how God has uniquely made them, rather than for how well people are like me. And which is, if I'm being very honest, how I probably used to function. And so, and probably still function in many ways, but I'm becoming much more aware of that. And I was thinking about a conversation I had with a friend not too long ago, and I was giving them a lot of affirmations about things I was seeing in their life. And they're things that I don't do so well, but I have an understanding now for their Enneagram type, for what their strengths are, and for what they're doing well. And I was able to affirm them based on their strengths, based on their Enneagram type, some things they were doing and what they're doing well, and use language that would feel very affirming for them. Right. And not just like, you bring so much energy and excitement to what you do. And they might say, thanks. Like, not really a value of theirs, or they don't see that as a compliment, but a 7 would be like, oh wow, that's the best compliment ever. Like, you make me have such a great time. Like, that's the best compliment for a 7, but for their Enneagram type, they'd probably be like, okay, like, sure. But able to use language that they would feel affirmed in, because that's how they're made and what they're going after. I just feel like we've got so many tools to like more intricately and intentionally love people well. And so I feel much more set up to obey the scriptures, to love like Christ, knowing how people are and how to affirm them and appreciate them and value their contribution to the world.
Yeah, I love that. I don't have anything to add. Yes, that's all very good.
That's
so
awesome.
true.
That's awesome. Okay. Last question, which is question 4 in the discussion, but just what spiritual insights have you gained? So maybe this is a spiritual discipline or a practice that has stood out to you, or certain scriptural verses, or just time with the Lord. What insights have you gained for your faith and spiritual life? And yeah, that's it.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about in our life group last week is we were talking about I think we're talking about spiritual practices. We're talking about the upstream and the downstream, which is kind of a new like concept for me. Like the upstream is harder, not as natural, and the downstream is more natural. And um, for me, one of my upstream practices, so one of the ones that's not as natural for me, it says like confession. And I thought that was interesting for a one, because ones can very naturally often like see where they fall short in their own view. But I thought what was actually one of the spiritual insights I've learned about myself is that it's not the actual confession, it's the accepting of the fullness of the grace of God for me. And learning that like when I come to God and I'm like, hey God, I messed up in this, God's not going to tell me to go fix it necessarily. Like God's grace covers it, right? And I'm always like, I'll fix it. And God's like, my grace has already covered you. And like for me, like learning to accept that and to give that in a more full way in my life has been a big like insight into maybe something that I need to continue to pray about. And you see, even now in my oneness, I'm going to say work on, right? I need to continue to work on that. And it's like, I need to continue to allow God to do that work in my life and to continue to be in prayer and just to accept God's huge, amazing, full grace. And then also to give myself and to ask for more capacity to give that more fully to everyone that I encounter. And two, I would say, with the ones, I think as a one, maybe I won't speak for all ones, but I know that in other ones that I've talked to, it's really easy to look at your description as a one and be like, well, one is the worst type. Well, look at all the negative things. It's like, it can be very easy because ones have such a sense of goodness, right? Like ones, a lot of times people will say perfectionists, and it's like, and I don't mean this the way it's going to sound, but most ones can look at something and can naturally see it in its best state, or like they can automatically see, how it was designed to be or how it could be improved, right? And there's an incredible gift in that. And just, I don't know, for me, just learning more about what it means to be able to see things in the goodness of how they were meant to be and what that means for us as Christians. And we can see the goodness of how God is restoring things, right? And how God brings redemption and how we can channel our hyper awareness of goodness into encouragement and growth of others and ourselves instead of criticism, right? And so we kind of have that choice. I'm sure, like, whatever pitfalls for every type, we have that choice where we can use that gift to bring about more of the kingdom of God, right? To make everything look more like Jesus, or to kind of go to the negative aspect of that, which for a one would just be criticism, right? So I can look at something and I can either criticize it or I can say, wow, I can really see all the potential here. And so for me, just learning more about myself in that way and how I can more contribute to what God is doing and how I can more identify what God is doing and then join in with that. And so that's just been kind of a big like theme for me throughout this series personally. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And I love that, even that articulation of, the practice of confession, not just the being aware of the sins, because that's the easy part, but like accepting and embracing the grace and not needing to work and earn. Like, don't worry, God, I'll fix it. I'll work it out. But allowing God's grace for sure. And it's just so interesting because I think about, for my type, it's just almost the opposite. It's like, I'm like more like, thanks God, your grace is, always covering me. So I know I'm good, like that's not the problem. It's like acknowledging my sins and what I did wrong and that it did cause hurt. Like that's really hard for me, so it's just that inverted kind of experience for sure. For me, spiritual insights, I do appreciate the upstream and downstream practices. I know for me, downstream is community and celebration and worship, and that just comes pretty naturally. But the upstream of solitude and silence and fasting are very important. And I learned in college, I had this whole season where I learned how to be alone with God, and that was like a big growth area for me. And as a single college student with, no wife or 3 kids, it was much easier to just spend hours alone And so one of my big challenges now is, okay, as a husband and a father of 3 young kids, and as a full-time pastor and as a student at Fuller Seminary, how do I still make sure I find that time to get alone and just be with the Lord and just process? And so that for me is definitely one of the big challenges. And I know that when I am feeling tired and worn out and doing too much, my temptation is to try to consume something or find some sort of external experience to help me get through or feel better. Even something as simple as like, oh, I need to get a drink from Solid, which is really good, but it's like, how am I going to get through the day? Oh, let me get a good drink, that will give me some motivation. And so I have that tendency, right, to go to things rather than to say like, okay, God, I need your presence to sustain me and to give me strength and to help me with this. So I think that's given me a lot of just spiritual insights into like why I am the way I am and how I function certain ways and what I'm doing. And I think that's been yeah, just really helpful for me. So I appreciate those practices. And even some of the verses that I shared in the sermon yesterday, just about like God desires to give us fullness of joy, like in his presence, there's fullness of joy, not just from like external things. And Paul writes to the Philippians about just being content in every situation and in every circumstance, being content with the Lord. And I think those are some verses that just really speak to me and just kind of speak to my soul and how I function. And so I've really appreciated how this series has helped me to really grow in my engagement with the Lord. And yeah, just to be a lot healthier and more Christ-like, for sure. Still a journey, still a lot to do and a lot to grow, but I feel like I'm on a good trajectory where I'm really learning and growing. So that's been awesome. Okay. Any other final thoughts before we wrap this thing up?
No, I don't think so. I'm excited to hear about type 9s this Sunday, and yeah, it'll be good.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to wrapping it up. It's very fitting to finish with the 9 because the 9 is the type that kind of like, is looking out for everyone else. They're on the top of the Enneagram on purpose, and they kind of care. They're very inclusive, and they care about everybody else's experiences almost more than their own. And so it's like naturally they put themselves last in a lot of ways because they care about everybody else so much. And so um, they're going to go last, but we're going to tell them that they're first in our book, that they're important. So thanks so much for joining us on Overflow. I hope this has been helpful and been a blessing for you. And make sure you're taking time this week to unpack on your own in prayer with some friends or some others that you can gather. What are you getting out of this series? How have you been growing? How are you more self-aware, more aware of others, and better able to love like Christ? And how have you grown spiritually? And so thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week at noon.